3 years after its release, Avengers Infinity War is still the most ambitious crossover event in history. While prior ensemble entries into the MCU had seen a gradual increase in the number of heroes per film, this unwieldy titan of a movie was to feature a whopping 24 heroes, twice as many as its immediate predecessor. But as the cast size for these films was creeping upward, so too was the difficulty of telling a cohesive narrative. Joss Whedon has spoken about the nightmare of juggling the abundance of characters in Avengers Age of Ultron, and Captain America Civil War finds itself caught between two disparate plot lines that never quite come together to form a meaningful whole. If an event as huge as Infinity War was to be anything more than pure fan service, it was going to need a powerful underlying theme to tie all of its characters' stories together. So, what's the main theme of Avengers Infinity War? Yes, haha, very good. No, it's
sacrifice.
Sacrifice underpins almost every aspect of this movie, from the two big emotional climaxes, to the villain's goal, even down to the way his minions hurl themselves at that force field. And because it remains laser focused on this idea of sacrifice throughout, Infinity War never feels bloated, even while its many heroes are scattered across different planets. In this video, I want to examine how writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely managed to tame this colossal beast, by using their characters' goals, beliefs, and actions to craft a perfectly balanced moral argument culminating in a dark truth about the world. One reason why Infinity War's story feels so cohesive is because of how its central theme was organically derived from its premise. To start out, all that Marcus and McFeely were given was
Thanos, which necessitates the use of the Infinity Stones. And if you want to get rid of people, you can.
While they opted to retain Thanos' comic book goal of wiping out half the universe, they also gave him the new, more interesting motive of preventing overpopulation, an idea that has eerie real-world parallels to China's historical one-child policy. Infinity War's plot is built around Thanos, not just in terms of him being the protagonist, but also in that his plan is the inciting incident that sets the story in motion. Madman tries to erase half of all life is this story's unique premise, setting it apart from previous Avengers installments, and this particular premise has sacrifice as a theme written all over it. It therefore makes sense that the writers chose to make this film an exploration of sacrifice, but what's especially clever is the way they do it. See, not only is sacrificing people Thanos' end goal, but it's also his method of achieving that goal, albeit on a smaller scale. From scene to scene, the way that Thanos goes about getting what he wants is by threatening to kill, and sometimes actually killing, individuals. Not only does this give Thanos clear and consistent characterization, but it's also an efficient way to incorporate philosophical stakes into the script, because whenever the characters are debating the ethics of sacrificing certain individuals, they are simultaneously commenting on the villain's end goal, and vice versa.
One life cannot stand in the way of defeating him.
But it should.
Infinity War actually features several verbal arguments between characters with opposing views on sacrifice. On one side of the debate is Thanos, a utilitarian consequentialist who believes that the ends always justify the means.
It's a simple calculus. If life is left unchecked, life will cease to exist.
The Avengers, meanwhile, are primarily
On the side of life.
taking an individualist, deontologist stance that's most explicitly stated by Captain America when he says,
We don't trade lives, Vision.
it's essentially the classic trolley problem, blown up to universal proportions. One notable caveat is the matter of self-sacrifice, with characters like Heimdall, Gamora, and Vision all willing to trade away their own lives for the greater good.
Because that's what heroes do.
For the Avengers, the immoral thing would be to stand by and allow others to sacrifice their lives, a belief seemingly rooted in the idea that there might always be another way.
It needs correction.
You don't know that!
Why is this any different?
Because you might have a choice.
Doctor Strange is something of an ideological double agent here. While he scoffs at Thanos' proposal of
Genocide.
as a solution, he also states early in the film that
If it comes to saving you, or the kid, or the time stone, I will not hesitate to let either of you die. I can't, because the universe depends on it.
Strange is clearly willing to bargain with people's lives up to a certain point.
I've come to bargain!
But over the course of the story, he undergoes a kind of positive change arc that ends with him giving up the stone to save Tony. And this unexpected move from Strange brings us to an important point. While Infinity War's dialogue does a great job of laying out the characters' contrasting beliefs, it's only by showing them act upon those beliefs that the narrative truly comes to life. In stories, actions really do speak louder than words. As John Truby writes in The Anatomy of Story, Moral argument doesn't mean your hero and opponent appear in the first scene and engage in a verbal argument about morality. Moral argument in a story is an argument of action you make by showing your hero and opponent taking certain means to reach a goal. This is how you weave theme through the story structure instead of preaching to the audience in the dialogue.
Congratulations, you're a prophet.
The most resonant tales are those that dramatize philosophical conflict, whether this is as broad as good versus evil in Star Wars, or as specific as the importance of natural justice in 12 Angry Men. And the language through which stories communicate this to us is primarily one of action and consequence. Let's look at how Infinity War conveys meaning through its characters' actions during key events, namely Thanos' acquisitions of each stone. Thanos retrieved the Power Stone before the film begins, but 4 out of the 5 remaining stone acquisitions are directly tied to sacrifice in some way. First, we have the Space Stone, which Loki reveals the location of out of refusal to sacrifice Thor. Likewise, Gamora reveals the location of the Soul Stone out of refusal to sacrifice Nebula, which Thanos is then only able to obtain through his willingness to sacrifice Gamora. Thanos later gets the Time Stone because Strange refuses to sacrifice Tony, and finally he retrieves the Mind Stone by sacrificing Vision. Throughout these scenes, the running theme is that Thanos wins because he is willing to do what the Avengers won't.
I'm the only one with the will to act on it.
All these actions and their consequences add up to what Robert McKee calls the narrative's controlling idea, which he defines as one clear, coherent sentence that expresses a story's irreducible meaning. This is comprised of 2 elements, the core value at stake and the clear cause for that value's status by the end of the story. In Infinity War, the core value at stake is life, both on an individual and a universal scale. Each time the Avengers score a victory, it represents an ideological win for life, but every time Thanos acquires another stone, the scales tip toward the contradictory value of death. Throughout the narrative, this value continues to shift back and forth between positive and negative charges as the 2 opposing sides compete, until, at the climax, one side triumphs over the other. This is what makes villains like Thanos so compelling. When you can see both sides of a story's moral argument, there's a genuine air of suspense as to how the conflict will be resolved. Whether or not the writers agree with Thanos is beside the point. Their job is to make the strongest possible case for each side, like a lawyer arguing for both parties in a court case. And in this particular case, Marcus and McFeely chose to play devil's advocate very strongly, because Avengers Infinity War is the highest grossing film of all time in which the villain actually wins. The Avengers' repeated refusal to trade lives ultimately proves to be their downfall, as Thanos' climactic victory reveals the controlling idea of the story, that mass loss of life occurs when we refuse to sacrifice individuals for a greater cause. Except, that's not quite the whole story. On 2 occasions throughout the movie, the Avengers actually compromise their own values, with Peter and Wanda reluctantly attempting to sacrifice Gamora and Vision for the greater good, respectively. Thanos even commends them both for these actions.
I understand, my child. I like you.
So why does he still triumph in the end from an ideological perspective? One could argue that the heroes simply acted too late. Had Peter killed Gamora earlier, or had Wanda destroyed the Mind Stone upon Vision's initial suggestion, it's possible that Thanos could have been prevented from ever acquiring all 6 stones. However, I think it's important to consider where Peter and Wanda's actions differ from those of Thanos. While the former's partners were both willing to sacrifice their own lives, the latter repeatedly kills without his victims' consent. We thus arrive at a new, more nuanced controlling idea. That is, mass loss of life occurs when we refuse to sacrifice individuals against their will for a greater cause. Avengers Infinity War is a great example of a story speaking through its structure. Having chosen to explore a theme that emerged organically from the premise, Marcus and McFeely crafted an impressively cohesive philosophical argument by putting their characters' beliefs in conflict with one another.
That's too high a price.
A small price to pay for salvation.
And then having those characters act upon their beliefs. After a display of dire consequences, when the dust of the deceased settles, the audience is faced with a dark moral message that's as surprising as it is nuanced. That the film presents these ideas so clearly without beating viewers over the head with them is a testament to the quality of its storytelling. In fact, for all I've spoken about it in this video, the word sacrifice is only mentioned twice throughout the entire narrative. And so, if you're going to try and make a distinction between theme park movies and cinema, maybe the MCU isn't the strongest example to back up your point.